boring history for sleep, weird stuff knights had to do before battle. Tonight, let's chill out and explore the medieval world of 13th century knighthood. We'll check out their weapons, the awesome war horses they rode, and the cool ceremonies that made young nobles into knights. For the next 2 hours, we'll dive deep into all the details of medieval warfare, every piece of gear, every ritual, every tradition. It's all designed to help you relax and drift off to sleep. So, let the info wash over you as we journey through this fascinating time in history. The foundation of noble power, arms and armor. Moving now into the heart of our exploration, let us consider the fundamental truth that separated the medieval noble from the common villain. This distinction, while certainly involving matters of birth, honor, and divine providence, rested most practically upon a simple yet profound reality: the noble's superiority in arms. Picture, if you will, the daily existence of these two classes of medieval society, and you will begin to understand how thoroughly this martial advantage shaped the entire structure of feudal civilization. The common villain, that hard-working foundation of medieval agricultural society, spent his days engaged in the endless cycle of agricultural labor. From dawn until dusk, these individuals worked with shovel and mattock, tending to the soil that would feed the entire community. Their hands grew calloused from handling the rough wooden handles of farming implements, their backs bent from the constant labor of planting, weeding, and harvesting. They developed remarkable skills in their chosen crafts, growing wheat with an understanding of soil and weather that would astound modern farmers, raising pigs with an intimate knowledge of animal husbandry, weaving cloth with techniques passed down through generations, and constructing houses with an architectural understanding born of necessity and tradition. Yet for all their considerable abilities in the peaceful arts, these same individuals found themselves utterly outmatched when it came to the science of warfare. Consider the dramatic inequality that existed when a common plowman, even when provided with weapons, attempted to face a man of gentle birth, who had been trained in arms from his earliest childhood. The difference was not merely one of equipment, though that certainly played a role, but of years upon years of dedicated training in the most complex and demanding physical skills imaginable. The typical peasant possessed what weapons he could afford or fashion: sturdy flails that doubled as grain threshing tools, boar spears originally designed for hunting, the dangerous wild pigs that roamed the forests, great knives that served multiple purposes in daily life, scythes mounted on long wooden poles to create makeshift polearms, and the humble bow and arrow that had served common folk for millennia. These were practical weapons, born of necessity and agricultural life, but they represented a completely different approach to warfare than the sophisticated armaments of the nobility. Imagine, if you will, the stark reality of such an encounter. 10 peasants, armed with their improvised weapons, meeting a single experienced cavalier, mounted on his reliable charger and encased in the full panoply of knightly warfare. The nobleman's armor, crafted by master armorers and representing an investment equivalent to a modern luxury automobile, would turn aside the relatively puny blows of peasant weapons. His superior training, his advantageous position, mounted high above his opponents, and his sophisticated weaponry would typically allow him to dispatch or wound perhaps 4 of his 10 opponents, before the remainder would have the good sense to flee into the protective darkness of the forest. This brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare explains, more than any divine right or noble bloodline, why the aristocracy held such complete dominance over the common people. The ability to project force, to defend one's property and dependence, and to participate in the complex web of feudal obligations all rested upon this fundamental military superiority. The core difference between a medieval noble and a commoner wasn't just about birth, honor, or some divine right. It was a harsh, practical truth, the noble's undeniable edge in combat. This military advantage fundamentally shaped feudal society, clearly seen in the very different daily lives of these two classes. Commoners, the diligent backbone of medieval agriculture, spent their days caught in the endless cycle of farm work. From sunrise to sunset, they labored with basic tools, their hands rough and backs aching from planting, weeding, and harvesting. They became incredibly skilled in their trades, showing deep knowledge of soil, weather, animal care, weaving, and building, all skills vital for the community's survival. Yet, despite their impressive talents in peaceful crafts, these individuals were no match in a fight. The gap between a regular plowman, even armed, and a nobleman, trained in warfare since childhood, was massive. This wasn't just about better gear, but years of tough, disciplined training in the most complex and physically demanding skills imaginable. A typical peasant's weapons were whatever they could get or make. Sturdy flails that also threshed grain, boar spears for hunting, multi-purpose large knives, scythes turned into makeshift polearms, and the ever-present bow and arrow. These practical, everyday weapons, born from necessity and farm life, represented a completely different approach to war compared to the nobility's advanced armaments. Imagine this brutal scenario: 10 peasants, armed with their makeshift tools, up against a single experienced knight on a strong horse, fully encased in knightly armor. The noble's armor, a marvel of engineering and a huge investment, would simply bounce off the weaker blows from peasant weapons. His superior training, elevated position, and sophisticated weaponry would usually allow him to take down or injure maybe 4 of his 10 opponents, before the rest wisely retreated into the safety of the woods. This harsh reality of medieval warfare, more than any divine right or noble heritage, explains why the aristocracy held absolute power over the common people. The power to project force, protect property and family, and participate in the complex system of feudal duties, all stemmed from this core military superiority. The noble as horseman, the foundation of cavalry dominance. The medieval noble was, almost without exception, a horseman. This simple fact shaped not only his approach to warfare, but his entire worldview and social identity. The great war steed provided him with much of his tactical advantage on the battlefield, while the remainder of his superiority came from the magnificent and extraordinarily expensive armor that enabled him to survive desperate contests that would prove fatal to lesser-equipped opponents. The psychology of the medieval warrior elite reflected this dependence on mounted combat. A good cavalier viewed missile weapons with something approaching contempt, preferring instead to come to close quarters where his superior training, equipment, and mounted advantage could prove decisive. The use of bows and arrows was considered beneath the dignity of a true knight, relegated instead to the villain class, who lacked both the resources and training for proper mounted combat. This attitude was reflected in the popular literature of the time. Consider the words of one medieval poet, who declared that coward was he who was the first archer. He was a weakling and dared not come close to his foe. Such sentiments were not merely poetic flourishes, but reflected genuine military doctrine. When medieval commanders counted their forces, they frequently reckoned by cavalry alone, dismissing infantry as barely worth consideration. Another minstrel sang of a legendary host, noting that there were in it 60,000 knights, not counting foot soldiers of whom no account is taken. This aristocratic disdain for missile weapons extended to the increasingly powerful mechanical devices that were beginning to change the nature of warfare. Old warriors particularly disliked the arbalist, those terrible crossbows that required a winch mechanism to draw back their powerful strings. These weapons enabled common-born infantrymen to send heavy bolts with sufficient force to penetrate even the finest mailshirts, representing a democratization of battlefield lethality that threatened the entire foundation of noble military supremacy. The crossbow was such a revolutionary and threatening weapon that in 1139, a Lateran council actually attempted to forbid its use against fellow Christians, though this prohibition proved largely ineffective in practice. While these weapons certainly proved useful in siege warfare, where they could clear ramparts of defenders or repel attacking forces, their effectiveness in open battle remained limited by their slow rate of fire. The complex winch mechanism required time to operate after each shot, making crossbowmen vulnerable to cavalry charges unless they received careful protection from other troops. For perhaps another century, the supremacy of the mailed knight would continue largely unchallenged. However, the seeds of change were already being sown. The English longbow, with its far more rapid rate of fire compared to the mechanical crossbow, would eventually herald the return of infantry dominance on medieval battlefields, though that transformation lay in the future. Nobles and their horses. Medieval nobles were pretty much always horsemen. This wasn't just about how they fought. It shaped their whole outlook on life and who they were in society. Their war horses gave them a huge edge in battle, and their super expensive, amazing armor let them survive fights that would have killed anyone else. The mindset of the medieval warrior elite showed how much they relied on mounted combat. A good knight looked down on ranged weapons, preferring to get up close, where their superior training, gear, and advantage from being on horseback could really win the day. Using bows and arrows was considered beneath a true knight, something left to peasants who didn't have the money or training for proper mounted fighting. This attitude popped up in the popular writings of the time. One medieval poet said, "Coward was he who was the first archer. He was a weakling and dared not come close to his foe." These weren't just fancy words. They reflected real military thinking. When medieval commanders counted their troops, they often only bothered with cavalry, barely even considering infantry. Another minstrel sang about a huge army, mentioning 60,000 knights, not counting foot soldiers of whom no account is taken. This noble contempt for ranged weapons even extended to the increasingly powerful mechanical weapons that were starting to change warfare. Old warriors particularly disliked the arbalist, those terrifying crossbows that needed a winch to pull back their strong strings. These weapons allowed common foot soldiers to shoot heavy bolts with enough force to pierce even the best mail shirts, which meant that deadly force was becoming more accessible to everyone, threatening the very foundation of noble military power. The crossbow was such a game-changing and dangerous weapon that in 1139, A church council actually tried to ban its use against other Christians, though that ban mostly failed in practice. While these weapons were definitely useful in sieges, where they could clear defenders from walls or push back attacking forces, their effectiveness in open battle was limited by their slow firing rate. The complicated winch mechanism took time to operate after each shot, leaving crossbowmen exposed to cavalry charges unless other troops protected them. For about another century, the armored knight's dominance would pretty much go unchallenged, but the seeds of change were already being sown. The English longbow, which fired much faster than the mechanical crossbow, would eventually bring back infantry dominance on medieval battlefields, though that shift was still in the future. The art of fighting in armor, training, and technique. Knights lived lives of constant preparation for combat, whether through actual warfare or through the violent exercises of tournament competition. Yet despite the frequency and intensity of these contests, the proportion of participants who were actually killed remained surprisingly low. This seeming contradiction finds its explanation in the remarkable effectiveness of medieval armor, which rendered the wearer nearly invulnerable to most forms of attack. After any significant battle, if one took the time to count the casualties, a clear pattern would emerge. The dead were almost invariably drawn from the ranks of the poor villain infantry, or the unfortunate camp followers who accompanied medieval armies. The knights, protected by their elaborate armor, typically survived even the most desperate encounters, though they might suffer injuries or be taken prisoner. This protection came at a considerable cost in terms of mobility and comfort. The armor that saved a knight's life also made him, in many ways, a prisoner of his own defensive equipment. The weight of even the lightest suit of armor in common use exceeded 55 pounds, while powerful knights often wore much heavier protection. The simple act of mounting one's horse became an elaborate procedure requiring assistance, and a knight who was unhorsed during combat found himself in desperate straits, often unable to rise without help from his squires or companions. To move about with reasonable freedom, while encased in this ponderous clothing of metal, required years of dedicated training. A knight had to learn to swing his shield with precision, control his horse through subtle shifts of weight and pressure, and handle his lance or sword with both strength and accuracy, all while bearing the considerable weight of his armor. Consider a young squire like Amory, whose entire adolescence was devoted to mastering these skills to the degree of precision necessary before he could claim the honor of knighthood. The preference of noblemen for mounted combat becomes entirely understandable when one considers the practical realities of fighting in such heavy armor. Fighting on foot was relegated to emergency situations when circumstances absolutely demanded it. The combination of armor weight and the tactical advantages of height and mobility made the horse not merely preferable, but essential to the knight's effectiveness in combat. Knights spent their lives constantly getting ready for combat, whether it was through actual wars or intense tournaments. But surprisingly, despite how often and hard these fights were, very few participants actually died. The reason for this seeming contradiction is how incredibly effective medieval armor was, making the wearer almost impossible to wound with most attacks. After any big battle, if you bothered to count the casualties, a clear pattern would show up. The dead were almost always the poor peasant foot soldiers or the unlucky camp followers who tagged along with medieval armies. Knights, protected by their fancy armor, usually made it through even the toughest fights, though they might get hurt or captured. This protection came at a significant cost when it came to moving around and being comfortable. The armor that saved a knight's life also made him, in many ways, trapped by his own defensive gear. Even the lightest common suit of armor weighed over 55 pounds, and powerful knights often wore much heavier protection. Just getting on their horse became a complicated process requiring help, and a knight knocked off his horse during a fight would be in serious trouble, often unable to get up without assistance from his squires or buddies. To move with reasonable freedom while wearing this heavy metal clothing took years of focused training. A knight had to learn to swing his shield accurately, control his horse with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, and handle his lance or sword with both power and precision, all while carrying the considerable weight of his armor. Think of a young squire like Amory, who spent his entire teenage years mastering these skills with the necessary exactness before he could earn the honor of knighthood. It makes total sense why noblemen preferred fighting on horseback when you consider the practical challenges of fighting in such heavy armor. Fighting on foot was only for emergencies, when there was absolutely no other choice. The combination of armor weight and the tactical benefits of height and mobility made the horse not just better, but essential for a knight to be effective in combat. The hauberk, the foundation of medieval armor. At the center of any suit of medieval armor lay the hauberk, that remarkable garment that represented both the height of metalworking technology and an investment equivalent to a small manor's annual income. A knight fortunate enough to possess a fine hauberk, light, considering its protective qualities, pliable enough to allow reasonable movement, and crafted from steel of such fine temper as to be nearly impenetrable, owned something that might literally save his life on countless occasions. The evolution of the hauberk tells a fascinating story of technological development and cultural exchange. In earlier times, before approximately the year 1000, the hauberk had been a relatively simple garment, a shirt of leather or quilted cloth covered with overlapping metal plates that resembled fish scales. This construction provided some protection while remaining relatively affordable to produce. The transformation to ringmail, probably influenced by ideas gathered from contact with Saracen armor during the Crusades, represented a quantum leap in both protective capability and manufacturing sophistication. The new hauberk consisted of a beautiful network of fine chains and links, each piece carefully crafted and fitted together to create a flexible yet protective garment. The skill required to produce such armor was extraordinary, and armorers were widely regarded as among the most talented craftsmen in medieval society. As one contemporary observer noted, they were the worthiest folk among all villains. The construction of a quality hauberk involved thousands of individual metal rings, each requiring multiple steps in its creation. The double or triple links were all carefully annealed, a heat treatment process that strengthened the metal while maintaining its flexibility. The constant maintenance required to keep such armor in fighting condition was considerable. The metal had to be kept bright and white through regular polishing, a task that typically fell to the knight's squires. Some knights possessed ceremonial hauberks that had been silvered, creating garments of extraordinary beauty and value. The design of a complete hauberk provided comprehensive protection for the wearer. Long sleeves protected the arms, while a skirt extending below the knees covered the thighs. A hood that came completely over the head and partially covered the cheeks protected these vulnerable areas. Some armor, included decorative elements. A few brightly colored threads worked into the links for ornament, but the flashing sheen of well-maintained steel provided sufficient glory for most warriors. The emotional significance of a hauberk often exceeded even its considerable monetary value. These garments became family heirlooms, passed down from father to son, or given as tokens of alliance between noble houses. Picture for a moment the scene when the widowed Countess of Bernon sent her husband's ring shirt to young Amory as a token of goodwill. The significance of such a gift extended far beyond its material worth. It represented a connection to the deceased knight's honor and a responsibility to uphold the reputation of its former owner. Amory's sworn promise never to dishonor the hauberk's previous owner while wearing it demonstrates the deep emotional and moral significance these practical items of warfare could carry. Chainmail was the main part of any medieval armor set. It was an amazing piece of metalwork tech and cost as much as a small manor's yearly income. If a knight had good chainmail, light, flexible, and made of tough, almost impenetrable steel, it could literally save their life many times over. How chainmail evolved is a cool story of tech progress and cultural sharing. Before about 1000 AD, chainmail was pretty basic. A leather or quilted shirt covered in overlapping metal plates, like fish scales. It offered some protection and was fairly cheap to make. But then came ringmail, probably inspired by Saracen armor from the Crusades. This was a huge leap in protection and manufacturing. The new chainmail was a beautiful web of fine chains and links, each piece carefully made and fitted to create flexible, protective clothing. It took incredible skill to make, and armorers were seen as some of the most talented craftspeople in medieval society. As one observer put it, they were the worthiest folk among all villains. Making quality chainmail involved thousands of individual metal rings, each taking many steps. The double or triple links were all carefully annealed, a heat treatment that strengthened the metal while keeping it flexible. Keeping the armor in fighting shape took a lot of work. It had to be kept bright and white, with regular polishing, usually done by the knight squires. Some knights even had ceremonial chainmail that was silvered, making them incredibly beautiful and valuable. A full chainmail suit protected the wearer completely. Long sleeves covered the arms, and a skirt went below the knees to cover the thighs. A hood went completely over the head and partly covered the cheeks for protection. Some armor had decorative bits, a few bright threads woven into the links, but the shiny look of well-kept steel was enough glory for most warriors. The emotional meaning of chainmail often went beyond its high cost. These items became family heirlooms, passed down from father to son, or given as gifts between noble families. Imagine when the widowed Countess of Bernon sent her husband's chainmail to young Amory as a gesture of goodwill. That gift meant so much more than its material value. It connected to the deceased knight's honor and the responsibility to uphold his reputation. Amory's sworn promise never to dishonor the chainmail's previous owner while wearing it shows the deep emotional and moral weight these practical war items could carry. Helmets, evolution, and protection. Moving now from the intricacies of body armor to the protection of the head, we encounter the medieval helmet, a piece of equipment that underwent constant evolution throughout the period. Helmets had been steadily becoming more complicated as armorers sought to balance protection with the practical needs of vision and breathing. Yet most warriors of the 13th century still preferred relatively simple designs. that prioritize proven effectiveness over innovative complexity. The typical helmet of this period was a plain conical steel cap, elegantly simple in its design, yet remarkably effective in its function. This basic form was encircled with a band of metal that might be adorned with gilt enamel for those knights wealthy enough to afford such decoration. The helmet also featured what was known as a nasal, a metal bar designed specifically to protect the vulnerable nose from sword cuts and other attacks. The method of securing the helmet reveals the integrated nature of medieval armor systems. Helmets were typically laced to the hood of the hauberk, using small leather straps, creating a unified defensive system rather than separate, independent pieces of equipment. This integration meant that the armor worked together as a cohesive whole, distributing the force of impacts and providing overlapping protection for vulnerable joints and openings. The practical realities of wearing a helmet influenced when and how it was used. Even a light and well-tempered helmet represented an uncomfortable burden for extended periods, affecting vision, hearing, and breathing. Consequently, knights seldom wore their helmets until the immediate prospect of combat made such protection necessary. The command, "Lace helmets," served as a battlefield order to prepare for action, signaling the imminent beginning of a charge or other combat maneuver. Conversely, when a knight was wounded, one of the first acts of mercy performed by his companions was to unlace his headpiece, providing relief and better access for medical attention. The early 13th century saw experimentation with closed visors designed to provide better protection against missile weapons. However, these early visors were immovable without removing the entire helmet, creating significant practical problems. If the visor became displaced during combat and the small eye holes shifted from their proper position, the wearer could become effectively blind at the worst possible moment. These limitations meant that the traditional open-style helmet would continue to dominate battlefield use until the development of more sophisticated plate armor and improved jointed helmets in the 14th century. Next, let's talk about medieval helmets, which were constantly changing over time. While armorers kept trying to improve helmets to balance protection with practical needs like seeing and breathing, most 13th century warriors still preferred simpler designs that were proven effective over complicated new ones. The typical helmet back then was a simple steel cone. It was basic, but really effective. This helmet usually had a metal band around it, which wealthy knights sometimes decorated with gold enamel. It also featured a nasal, a metal bar, specifically designed to protect the vulnerable nose from sword cuts and other attacks. How the helmet was attached shows how medieval armor systems worked together. Helmets were usually tied to the chainmail hood with small leather straps, creating a single defensive system instead of separate pieces of gear. This meant the armor functioned as one unit, spreading out the force of impacts and providing overlapping protection for weak spots and openings. The practical challenges of wearing a helmet influenced when and how it was used. Even a light, well-made helmet was uncomfortable for long periods, affecting vision, hearing, and breathing. So, knights rarely wore their helmets until they were about to fight. The command, "Lace helmets," was a battlefield order to get ready for action, signaling an imminent charge or other maneuver. On the flip side, if a knight was wounded, one of the first merciful acts his companions would perform was to unlace his helmet, providing relief and better access for medical care. In the early 13th century, People experimented with closed visors to offer better protection against arrows and other projectiles. However, these early visors were fixed and couldn't be moved without taking off the whole helmet, which caused major problems. If the visor shifted during combat and the small eye holes moved out of place, the wearer could become effectively blind at the worst possible moment. Because of these limitations, the traditional open-style helmet continued to be dominant on the battlefield until the development of more advanced plate armor and improved hinged helmets in the 14th century. Shields, defense, and offense combined. The third great component of knightly protection was the shield, a piece of equipment that had been evolving in response to improvements in other armor components. As hauberks and helmets became more effective, shields had gradually become smaller, though they remained essential for comprehensive protection. No knight would trust solely to his body armor, understanding that active defense with a shield remained crucial for survival in combat. Beyond its obvious defensive functions, a skilled warrior understood that a shield could serve offensive purposes as well. A sharp thrust with its edge, or a powerful push with its broad surface, could often knock an opponent off balance or even to the ground, creating opportunities for follow-up attacks. This dual nature meant that shield work represented nearly as complex a martial art as swordsmanship itself. Consider Amory's new shield, representative of the best contemporary design. Its semi-oval shape, slightly pointed at the bottom, provided coverage from shoulder to knees, while the knight sat mounted on his horse. The construction of such a shield required remarkable skill from multiple craftsmen. The foundation consisted of the stoutest available hide, carefully selected for its durability and flexibility. This was backed with light but tough wood, chosen for its ability to absorb impacts without splintering. A strong rim of metal provided structural integrity for the entire assembly. The shield curved slightly inward, following the natural contours of the body for better protection. At its center was positioned a metal knob, usually crafted from brilliant brass, which gave the shield its alternative name of buckler, derived from this strong central boss, or bouclier, in the French terminology. The carrying system involved a large leather strap that allowed the shield to be suspended from the neck during travel or non-combat activities. However, when action was imminent, the knight would run his left arm through two strong handles that provided much more secure control during combat. The creation of a shield required nearly as much skill as the manufacture of a hauberk. The challenge lay in combining wood, leather, and metal into a unified mass that would neither split under the impact of weapons nor be easily pierced by thrusting attacks. The front surface was highly decorated, and while the elaborate heraldic systems of later periods had not yet fully developed, every cavalier displayed some distinctive design. Lions, eagles, dragons, crosses, and floral scrollwork were popular choices, serving both to identify the bearer and to display his aesthetic preferences and family connections. The handling of a shield represented a science nearly as complex as swordsmanship. A trained warrior learned to coordinate shield and sword, or shield and lance, making them work together almost as a single weapon system. The shield could be used to bind an opponent's weapon, to create openings for counterattacks, or to deliver stunning blows in its own right. This level of coordination required years of practice and represented one of the distinguishing characteristics between trained knights and common soldiers. The sword, the noble's most cherished weapon. Nevertheless, When we turn our attention to the strictly offensive weapons that define knightly warfare, we must acknowledge that the weapon par excellence was undoubtedly the sword. The relationship between a baron and his sword often exceeded in emotional intensity his feelings for his wife, his horse, or indeed any other possession. These weapons were treated almost as if they possessed personalities of their own, becoming companions and confidants throughout a warrior's career. Knights frequently endeavored to keep the same sword throughout their entire lives, developing an intimate familiarity with its balance, its capabilities, and its quirks. The epic literature of the period reflects this deep emotional attachment. The legendary hero Roland was said to converse regularly with his sword Durendal, while Ogier, the Dane, maintained similar conversations with his blade Brands. Contemporary knights followed these fictional examples. Consider the Count Conon, who swore his most serious oaths, "By my good sword, haute mise," while young Amory had chosen to name his new weapon Joyeuse, after the great blade traditionally associated with the Emperor Charlemagne. The variations in sword design provided endless topics for discussion among warriors. Enthusiasts could revive any flagging conversation by inquiring whether their companion preferred a tapering blade or one of uniform thickness and weight throughout its length. Each design philosophy offered distinct advantages in different combat situations, and the choice often reflected both practical considerations and personal fighting style. The typical sword of this period measured approximately 3 inches in width at the hilt, tapering gradually to a point over a blade length of roughly 32 inches. This represented a compromise between cutting power, thrusting ability, and the practical limitations imposed by metallurgy and the knight's physical strength. The hilt required considerable attention to both function and decoration. The crossguard and grip needed to provide secure control during the violent movements of combat, while the pommel served both to balance the weapon and to provide space for decoration. The ornamentation of a knight's sword reflected both his wealth and his piety. The hilt should be adorned with gilt-work, preferably set with pearls, if the owner could afford such luxury. The pommel at the end of the hilt traditionally contained a small chamber housing saints' relics, placed behind a piece of crystal that revealed these holy objects to view. Consider the relics contained in Conon's sword, haute mise, dried blood of Saint Basil, several hairs of Saint Maurice, and lint from the robe worn by Saint Mary Magdalene after her repentance. These sacred materials served a practical purpose beyond their spiritual significance. Whenever a knight needed to authenticate a promise or oath, he could simply place his hand on his sword hilt, and his vow would be instantly registered in heaven. The lance, the knight's primary weapon. The lance represented the other great weapon of medieval cavalry, typically employed in the initial phases of combat before warriors resorted to their swords after the lance was broken or lost. The average lance measured no more than 10 feet in length, a dimension carefully calculated to provide maximum reach, while remaining manageable for a mounted warrior. The business end of the lance featured a lozenge-shaped head, crafted from the finest available steel. Poitou and Castile were particularly renowned for producing steel of exceptional quality for weapon points. The selection and preparation of the wooden shaft required equal care, as the warrior's life might depend on the reliability of this component during the violent shock of horse-to-horse encounters. The wood had to be straight, tough, and supple, capable of flexing under stress without breaking. Ashwood was generally considered the optimal choice, offering the best combination of strength and flexibility. The process of properly drying the wood was crucial. Improperly seasoned timber might fail at the worst possible moment, leaving the knight defenseless just as combat was joined. Unlike many later lance designs, the typical 13th century lance featured no handle or grip on the butt end. The art of grasping the round wooden shaft firmly, holding the long weapon level with the hip, and directing the sharp tip accurately onto the opponent's shield, regardless of how the target might shift or angle his defense, represented a martial skill that possibly exceeded even the complexities of swordsmanship. The coordination required for effective lance work involved the knight's entire body, working as a unified system. The horse had to be guided through subtle pressure from the knees, since the hands were occupied with shield and lance. The shield needed constant adjustment with the left hand to maintain proper defensive coverage, while the lance was managed with the right. The eye and nervous system had to maintain perfect control under the stress of rapid approach and violent collision. When all these elements came together successfully, man and horse functioning as a single, unified weapon system, the result was an experience that contemporary accounts describe as unparalleled in its excitement and effectiveness. The sensation of thundering across the field, perfectly balanced and controlled, aimed like a living projectile at one's opponent, represented the ultimate expression of knightly warfare. The great war horses, companions in combat. Yet even the finest armor and weapons would prove useless without the magnificent war horses that carried knights into battle. Indeed, few humans enjoyed a higher place in a baron's affections than his favorite destrier, that great war horse upon whom his life and honor depended. These animals were far more than mere transportation. They were comrades in hunt, tournament, and battle, possessing intelligence and loyalty that often proved crucial to their riders' survival. The relationship between knight and horse was built through years of intimate cooperation. From boyhood, a cavalier lived almost constantly in the saddle, developing an intuitive understanding of his mount's capabilities, temperament, and responses. In moments of danger, when squires and vassals might prove unavailable or inadequate, the knight's horse often provided the difference between life and death. When these magnificent animals failed or were killed, experienced warriors knew to commend their souls to the saints, for purgatory likely awaited. The care lavished upon these precious animals reflected their enormous value and importance. War horses were fed with the same attention to quality and nutrition that might be devoted to a delicate lady. They were groomed and decorated with elaborate trappings, and when illness struck, they received medical attention that often exceeded the care available to most Christian inhabitants of the castle. This level of attention was not mere sentimentality, but practical necessity. A knight's survival depended absolutely on his mount's health and capabilities. The literature of the period abounds with stories illustrating the remarkable intelligence and loyalty of these animals. Tales tell of horses rescuing their masters from dangerous situations and standing faithful watch over them during vulnerable moments. One particularly touching story describes a knight who, after 7 years' absence, was not recognized by his betrothed, but was immediately identified by his faithful destrier. Another anecdote tells of a knight who, when asked what would bring him the greatest joy in paradise, replied simply, "To see Blanchard, my old horse." Given such deep emotional and practical bonds, Enormous attention was devoted to horse breeding throughout medieval Europe. Wealthy seigneurs took particular pride in their breeding stallions, and even monasteries maintained elaborate breeding stables as part of their economic activities. A fine horse represented a gift of extraordinary value to any potentate, often exceeding even a notable hunting hawk in its significance. Many of the finest horses were designated as Arabian, though these animals more likely originated in North Africa rather than the Arabian Peninsula proper. French breeding programs had developed horses that equaled the best foreign stock, particularly producing powerful steeds that, while perhaps not quite as swift as their Oriental counterparts, proved better able to carry a knight encased in the ponderous armor necessary for medieval warfare. Gascon horses enjoyed particular renown throughout Europe, and consider Count Conon's special pride in a brood mare acquired from the Bordeaux region. However, certain social conventions governed the choice of mount. To ride a mare was considered unknightly, dismissed with the phrase, "the women to the women," probably reflecting ancient Teutonic prejudices about appropriate masculine behavior. The hierarchy of horses within a noble household reflected the complex social structure of medieval society. While serving as a squire, Aymery had found the care of Count de Bernon's horses to be one of his primary duties. This responsibility was far from trivial, as every magnate maintained several different types of horses for various purposes. The stable included palfreys, handsome steeds of comfortable pace, used for peacetime riding, as well as the special destreur, reserved for battle. The phrase, "to mount the high horse," referring to the destreur, came to symbolize the display of pride, not through vain boasting, but through the exhibition of oneself in terrible weapons of war. However, the young squire was not expected to concern himself with the lord's honcennes, ordinary steeds designated for servants, or the sommieres used for carrying baggage. These humbler creatures, while necessary for the functioning of the household, lay beneath the attention of one destined for knighthood. Horse colors, names, and equipment. The aesthetic preferences for war horses followed established conventions that reflected both practical and cultural considerations. White was the most favored color, considered the most noble and striking for a knight's primary mount. After white, dappled gray was preferred, followed by bay or chestnut. These color preferences were not merely matters of fashion, but carried symbolic significance in a culture where visual display communicated social status and personal worth. Medieval poets exhausted their considerable skills in describing beautiful steeds, approaching these descriptions with the same elaborate metaphors and detailed attention they devoted to beautiful women. Consider one bard's description of a Gascon horse. His hair outshone the plumage of a peacock. His head was lean, his eye gray like a falcon, his breast large and square, his crupper broad, his thigh round, and rump tight. All beholding him exclaimed, they had never seen a handsomer creature. Such magnificent animals naturally received names befitting their status and importance. The legendary Emperor Charlemagne's destreur was known as the Great Tencendur, while the hero, Roland, charged into battle, mounted on Veillantif. Carbonel, Palantamur, and Grisart were names familiar throughout the chivalric world. Count Conon's beloved companion was called Regibet, an animal so well trained and trusted that the Baron could ride him safely without bit, bridle, or spurs, relying entirely on the bond of understanding between them. The harness and equipment of the war horse remained relatively simple during this period, though later ages would develop elaborate armor and trappings for these animals. The stirrups and high saddle could be gilded and even set with pearls for those wealthy enough to afford such decoration. More noticeable and delightful were the dozens of small bells attached to various parts of the harness. These bells jingled merrily, creating a sound reminiscent of sleigh bells as the great steeds pounded along roads or across battlefields. The path to knighthood, Amory's preparation. Now let us turn our attention to young Amory, who had grown up in this world where hauberks, helms, shields, swords, and lances formed the common currency of daily conversation. From his earliest years, when he first began to speak, he had been surrounded by discussions of armor quality, weapon balance, and horse breeding. This environment had shaped his understanding of the world and his place within it. His knowledge of horseflesh far exceeded his understanding of that other important aspect of aristocratic life, women, a reflection of the thoroughly masculine and martial culture in which he had been raised. The priorities of noble education were clear. First came the arts of war, then the management of estates, and only later the social graces required for courtly interaction. As he approached the age for knighthood, Amory possessed the supreme confidence typical of young warriors who had never faced serious adversity. He was equally confident that fame, comparable to that of legendary heroes like Roland or Godfrey of Bouillon, awaited him, provided the saints chose to assist his endeavors. This confidence was not mere boyish arrogance, but reflected the systematic training and preparation that had occupied his entire youth. In his daydreams, Amory had imagined being dubbed knight by the king himself after performing mighty deeds on the field of battle, still covered with the blood and grime of heroic combat. Such dramatic scenarios belonged to the realm of romance rather than reality, but they reflected the young man's understanding of knighthood as the ultimate achievement of noble life. At least he could take satisfaction in having a brother who treated him as a brother indeed, neither keeping him in the background nor withholding his rightful inheritance. This generous treatment contrasted sharply with the fate of many younger sons who found themselves relegated to secondary positions within their families or forced to seek their fortunes through church careers or military service to foreign lords. The absence of family and the role of the suzerain. It represented a source of considerable grief to Amory that his father had not lived to witness his son's elevation to knighthood. For any good father, seeing his children achieve full warrior status represented one of life's greatest joys and satisfactions. The ceremony marked not only the young man's coming of age, but also the successful completion of the father's primary responsibility in raising a son. However, in some of the more disordered fiefs throughout the realm, fathers had to watch carefully for signs that their newly knighted offspring might be influenced by disloyal vassals. These troublemakers would sometimes whisper to young knights, "Your father is old and can no longer rule the barony effectively. Seize it for yourselves." Even kings had to guard against this particular danger. King Philip Augustus had knighted his heir, Prince Louis, only after the young man had taken a solemn oath not to enroll armed followers or perform other sovereign acts without his father's specific consent. The theoretical framework governing the dubbing of new knights was relatively simple. Any knight possessed the authority to grant a doubment to any person he deemed worthy. However, the practical realities were far more complex and socially constrained. A knight who dubbed a villain, except under the most exceptional circumstances, would jeopardize his own claim to nobility. Similarly, If he granted the honor to young, untried petty nobles of questionable worthiness, he would face ridicule, and their claims to the rank would be promptly questioned by other members of the warrior class. Fathers had often dubbed their own sons, but it was considered far more prestigious for a young noble to seek the honor from his suzerain or another lord of superior rank. Amory learned with considerable satisfaction that the Duke of Quelquepart had consented to give the buffet of honor. The higher the rank of the knight performing the ceremony, the greater the glory and legitimacy it conferred upon the newly made knight. The secular nature of early knighthood ceremonies. The ceremony of adablement remained, during this period, a decidedly secular affair. While certain religious elements had begun to intrude into the proceedings, the fundamental character of knighthood remained military, rather than ecclesiastical. The custom could trace its origins back to the crude rites by which Germanic tribes had initiated young men into the ranks of full warriors, representing a continuity of martial tradition stretching back centuries. Beyond the vigil in the church and the hearing of Mass, the religious components of the ceremony remained limited. Some clerical customs were indeed beginning to appear. Young nobles with sufficient resources and ambition sometimes journeyed to Rome to be dubbed by the Pope himself, viewing this as the ultimate validation of their new status. Others had begun kneeling before bishops and requesting knighthood as a form of lay consecration, treating their martial calling as a sacred vocation. However, prevailing opinion still frowned upon excessive ecclesiastical involvement in what was fundamentally a military institution. Adubement was viewed as a martial business, and many believed that churchmen should maintain their proper sphere rather than interfering in secular affairs. It would be more than a century before religious sentiment and romantic idealization could significantly alter what had long been a distinctly practical and military ceremony. Timing and multiple candidates. The selection of appropriate dates for knighthood ceremonies followed established traditions that connected the secular celebration to the church calendar. Easter, Ascension Day, Pentecost, and St. John's Day were all considered acceptable times for adubements, though there were plenty of precedents for combining the ceremony with other important family celebrations. A knighthood ceremony might be scheduled to coincide with an important wedding or the baptism of an heir to a barony, creating a festival atmosphere that enhanced the significance of all the events being celebrated. In the present case, as happened very often, Amory would not be the sole focus of attention during the ceremony. The Duke of Quelquepart had agreed to give the qualifying blow to 5 other young men, all sons of vassals holding lands within the Saint Aliquis domain. This group ceremony was actually quite modest by the standards of royal courts, where 20 or more candidates might be knighted together during major celebrations. Preparations and festivities. The night before the ceremony, the entire castle buzzed with activity comparable to the preparations for a major wedding. Additional guests had arrived from throughout the region, requiring extensive arrangements for hospitality. The feast preparations were elaborate, with multiple courses being prepared by teams of cooks working through the night. Jongleurs and other entertainers had been engaged to provide music and storytelling throughout the extended celebrations. The great hall of the castle had been transformed into a display area, where Adela and Alianor, serving as substitutes for Amory's deceased mother, had carefully laid out the costume he would assume the following day. These articles had been selected with the same attention to detail and symbolic significance that characterized bridal preparations. The spotless white shirt symbolized purity and new beginnings. The costly robe of ermine demonstrated the family's wealth and status. The spurs of gold represented the knight's role as a mounted warrior and his right to command others. The festival atmosphere extended beyond the castle walls to encompass the broader community. A host of beggars had gathered in the bailey, drawn by the tradition of unusual generosity and almsgiving that accompanied such celebrations. Even the invited guests participated in this charitable display, throwing around copper coins to demonstrate their own nobility and participation in the aristocratic virtue of largesse. The ritual bath and vigil preparation. As evening fell, Amory and his 5 companions underwent a ritual bath that carried genuine spiritual significance beyond its practical function of cleanliness. This ceremony was performed with considerable solemnity, as it represented the symbolic effacement of all past mistakes and sins, allowing the bathers to emerge in a state of purity appropriate for their new status. The long wooden bathtubs were filled with heated water, and the young men sat quietly, rather than engaging in the boisterous splashing and merrymaking that might characterize an ordinary bath. While they dressed themselves in preparation for the night's vigil, smiling sergeants appeared bearing presents from relatives, their suzerain, and noble friends. These gifts consisted primarily of articles of costly apparel, silken garments with fur linings, designed to provide warmth and comfort during the long night ahead. The generosity of these gifts paralleled the shower of presents typically bestowed upon a bride, reflecting the parallel significance of the knighthood ceremony and the young woman's transition into married life. The significance of these gifts extended beyond their material value. Each present carried with it the implicit promise of continued support and recognition from the giver. When a vassal presented a young knight with a fine cloak or a pair of decorated gloves, he was acknowledging the recipient's new status and expressing confidence in his future achievements. These tokens would serve as reminders of the relationships and obligations that bound the new knight to his community of peers. As the sun finally disappeared behind the western walls of the castle, the 6 young men prepared to enter the chapel for their night-long vigil. This period of prayer and reflection had become an established part of the knighthood ceremony, though its religious character represented a relatively recent addition to what had originally been a purely secular ritual. The vigil served multiple purposes. It provided time for spiritual preparation, demonstrated the candidate's dedication and endurance, and created a dramatic pause before the climactic moment of dubbing. The sacred vigil, a night of prayer and contemplation. The chapel had been specially prepared for this solemn occasion. Fresh rushes covered the stone floor, their sweet fragrance mingling with the incense that would burn throughout the night. Dozens of candles flickered in wall sconces and on the altar, creating a warm, golden atmosphere that encouraged quiet contemplation. The altar itself had been decorated with the finest altar cloths available, while the sacred vessels gleamed with recent polishing. Amory and his companions knelt before the altar, their knees resting on cushions that had been thoughtfully provided for the long hours ahead. Their weapons lay arranged before them on the altar steps. Swords, shields, and helms, positioned with careful precision to catch the candlelight. These implements of war, temporarily transformed into objects of religious contemplation, would receive the priest's blessing before dawn broke over the castle walls. The priest, who would oversee their vigil, was Father Benedict, a learned man who had served the Saint Aliquis family for more than 20 years. His presence provided both spiritual guidance and practical supervision, ensuring that the young men maintained appropriate decorum throughout the night. Father Benedict understood the significance of this moment in their lives and had prepared himself to offer counsel should any of the candidates seek guidance during their long hours of reflection. The mental discipline required for a successful vigil was considerable. The young men had to remain awake and alert while engaging in sustained prayer and meditation, resisting the natural tendency to drowse during the quiet hours before dawn. Some candidates found it helpful to focus on specific prayers or psalms, repeating familiar words that provided structure for their thoughts. Others preferred to contemplate the responsibilities they would soon assume, mentally rehearsing their commitment to honor, service, and protection of the innocent. Amory found his thoughts drifting between prayer and daydream as the night progressed. He reflected on the training that had brought him to this moment, remembering countless hours in the practice yard, learning to handle sword and shield, endless riding lessons that had made him one with his destrier, and the patient instruction of his mentors in the codes of chivalric behavior. Each memory reinforced his understanding of the magnitude of the step he was about to take. The vigil also provided an opportunity for the candidates to contemplate the spiritual dimensions of knighthood. While the ceremony remained fundamentally secular, the Church had gradually developed theological interpretations that cast the knight as a protector of Christian society. This role involved specific obligations: defending the Church, protecting widows and orphans, maintaining justice, and using one's martial skills in service of righteous causes. The hours of prayer helped candidates internalize these responsibilities and commit themselves to upholding these ideals. As midnight approached, the young men could hear the sounds of continued celebration from the great hall, where their families and guests maintained their own vigil of feasting and entertainment. The contrast between the solemn atmosphere of the chapel and the festive mood elsewhere in the castle highlighted the dual nature of the knighthood ceremony, both sacred commitment and secular celebration. The sacred vessels and symbolic elements. The altar before which the young men prayed had been arranged with careful attention to both religious protocol and the specific requirements of the knighthood ceremony. The sacred vessels used in the regular celebration of Mass occupied their traditional positions, but additional elements had been added to reflect the martial nature of the occasion. A small font containing holy water stood ready for the blessing of weapons, while specially consecrated oil waited to anoint the candidates' hands and foreheads. Father Benedict had spent considerable time during the preceding week preparing for this ceremony, consulting ancient texts to ensure that every detail followed established tradition. The prayers he would recite had been composed specifically for such occasions, invoking divine protection for the new knights and asking for guidance in their future endeavors. These prayers represented a synthesis of Christian theology and military necessity, acknowledging that the knight's calling required both spiritual strength and physical prowess. The weapons themselves, lying before the altar, served as focal points for the candidate's meditation. Each sword, shield, and helm represented not merely a tool of war, but a symbol of the knight's commitment to justice and protection. The metalwork caught and reflected the candlelight, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to imbue these objects with almost mystical significance. Amory found himself particularly drawn to his sword Joyeuse, its polished blade gleaming in the flickering light. The weapon had been crafted by Master Guillaume, the finest armorer in the region, and its balance and beauty reflected the skill of generations of metalworkers. The pommel contained the sacred relics that would make his oaths binding in heaven, while the crossguard bore intricate engravings that told the story of his family's martial heritage. The shields of all 6 candidates displayed their distinctive heraldic devices, creating a colorful display that proclaimed their noble lineages and family connections. These symbols would identify them on the battlefield and in tournament, serving as visual representations of their honor and achievements. The art of heraldry was becoming increasingly sophisticated, with specific rules governing the use of colors, patterns, and symbolic elements. The physical and mental challenges of the vigil. As the night progressed, the physical demands of the vigil began to test the candidates' endurance and determination. Kneeling for hours on stone floors, even with the comfort of cushions, created steadily increasing discomfort. Their backs ached from maintaining proper posture, while their knees grew numb from the constant pressure. Yet showing weakness or seeking relief would have been considered disgraceful, and each young man was determined to complete the vigil with honor. The mental challenges proved equally demanding. Maintaining focus during the long, quiet hours required considerable discipline, especially for young men accustomed to active, physical pursuits. The temptation to let their minds wander to thoughts of the coming ceremony, future adventures, or even mundane concerns about their estates required constant vigilance. Father Benedict had instructed them in techniques for maintaining concentration, suggesting that they focus on specific prayers or contemplate particular virtues associated with knighthood. The darkness beyond the chapel windows seemed absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of torches on the castle walls. This isolation from the outside world enhanced the sense of spiritual retreat and contemplation. The candidates felt separated not only from their normal daily routines, but from the ordinary concerns of secular life. This temporary withdrawal from worldly affairs prepared them mentally for the transformation they would undergo at dawn. Sleep represented the greatest enemy during these quiet hours. The warm atmosphere of the chapel, combined with the physical exhaustion from the day's preparations and the rhythmic nature of repeated prayers, created conditions that naturally encouraged drowsiness. Each candidate had to develop personal strategies for remaining alert. Some focused intently on the pain in their knees as a reminder to stay awake, while others engaged in mental exercises that required active concentration. The collective nature of the vigil provided both support and accountability. When one candidate showed signs of drowsiness, the others would quietly encourage him through subtle gestures or whispered prayers. This mutual support reinforced the bonds that would unite them as brothers in arms, creating relationships that would prove crucial during their future military service together. Dawn approaches, preparation for the ceremony. As the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn, activity within the chapel intensified. Father Benedict began the final prayers of the vigil, his voice carrying clearly through the sacred space as he invoked divine blessing upon the candidates and their weapons. The ancient Latin words seemed to resonate with particular power in the pre-dawn stillness, connecting the present ceremony with centuries of similar rituals. The young men felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration as they realized their long night of prayer was nearly complete. The approaching dawn marked not just the end of their vigil, but the beginning of their transformation from squires to knights. This transition would change every aspect of their lives, from their legal status and property rights to their social relationships and personal obligations. Outside the chapel, the castle was already stirring with preparations for the coming ceremony. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying fresh linens, polished armor, and elaborate garments. The great hall was being transformed into a ceremonial space, suitable for the dubbing ritual, with banners hung from the rafters and special seating arranged for the distinguished guests who would witness the proceedings. The kitchen staff had been working through the night to prepare the feast that would follow the ceremony. Multiple courses were being prepared, including special delicacies that would demonstrate the family's wealth and hospitality. Huge haunches of beef turned slowly on spits over the great fires, while skilled cooks prepared more elaborate dishes that would showcase their culinary artistry. The stable boys had spent the early morning hours grooming the destriers that would carry the new knights in their first ceremonial procession. Each horse had been brushed until its coat gleamed, while their manes and tails had been braided with colorful ribbons. The elaborate horse trappings had been polished and adjusted to ensure a perfect fit, creating a display worthy of the solemn occasion. The blessing of arms, sacred transformation of weapons. As the first rays of sunlight penetrated the chapel windows, Father Benedict began the formal blessing of the weapons that lay arrayed before the altar. This ceremony transformed ordinary implements of war into sacred instruments of divine justice, imbuing them with spiritual significance that would influence their use throughout the knights' careers. The priest moved slowly among the weapons, sprinkling each with holy water, while reciting prayers that had been composed specifically for this purpose. The ancient words asked for divine protection for the weapons bearers and requested that these instruments be used only in righteous causes. The blessing ceremony acknowledged the dual nature of knightly weapons. They were tools of violence that must be employed in service of peace and justice. Each sword received individual attention during the blessing, with Father Benedict laying his hands upon the blade while invoking the protection of warrior saints. Saint Michael, the Archangel, the divine warrior who had defeated Satan in cosmic battle, was particularly invoked to guide these earthly warriors in their struggles against evil. Saint George, the dragon slayer, was asked to grant courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The shields, too, received their share of sacred attention. These defensive implements were blessed not only for their protective qualities, but for their symbolic representation of the knight's duty to shield the innocent from harm. The heraldic devices displayed on each shield were acknowledged as sacred symbols that would identify the bearer's commitment to honor and justice. The helmets, those vital protectors of the knight's most vulnerable area, were blessed with prayers for wisdom and clear judgment in the heat of battle. The priest acknowledged that a knight's head contained not only his life, but his capacity for moral reasoning, and that protection of this faculty was essential for maintaining chivalric ideals, even under the stress of combat. As each weapon received its blessing, the candidates felt a profound sense of transformation taking place. These were no longer merely tools of war, but sacred instruments that carried with them the authority and responsibility of divine commission. The weight of this responsibility was both inspiring and sobering, reminding the young men that their new status carried obligations as well as privileges. The final preparations, dressing for transformation. With the blessing of weapons complete, the time had arrived for the candidates to prepare themselves for the actual dubbing ceremony. They rose from their kneeling positions with considerable stiffness, their bodies protesting after the long night of immobility. Yet the anticipation of the coming transformation energized them despite their physical discomfort. Adela and Eleanor, who had waited patiently outside the chapel throughout the night, now entered to assist Amory with his ceremonial costume. The other candidates received similar assistance from female relatives or trusted servants, each person involved understanding the sacred nature of the dressing ritual. Every garment had been selected for its symbolic significance, as well as its practical function. The white shirt, spotless and freshly laundered, symbolized the purity of intention that should characterize a true knight. As Amory pulled it over his head, he thought of the spiritual cleansing he had undergone during his night of prayer and the commitment to moral excellence that his new status would require. The linen was of the finest quality available, soft against his skin and carefully tailored to provide comfort beneath the heavy armor he would soon don. The hose, made from wool of exceptional quality and dyed a rich brown, covered his legs with practical protection, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to the ceremony. These garments had been specially commissioned for the occasion, crafted by skilled weavers who understood the importance of their work. Every stitch had been placed with care, creating garments worthy of this momentous day. The robe of ermine that came next represented perhaps the most expensive single item in Amory's ceremonial costume. The white fur, spotted with the characteristic black tail tips of the ermine, could only be worn by those of noble birth and represented a visual declaration of aristocratic status. The garment was heavy and warm, its rich texture providing both comfort and magnificence. As each garment was added, Amory felt himself being transformed, not merely in appearance but in identity. The clothes he wore marked him as belonging to a specific class and carrying particular responsibilities. When the ceremony was complete, he would never again be able to dress as a simple squire or move through the world with the freedom of one whose obligations were limited and clearly defined. The Great Hall, Theater of Transformation. The Great Hall of the castle had been transformed into a magnificent theater, suitable for the solemn ceremony about to unfold. Tapestries depicting scenes of knightly valor hung from the walls, while fresh rushes covered the floor and provided a clean, sweet-smelling surface for the proceedings. The high table had been positioned to provide the Duke of Quelquepart with an elevated platform from which to conduct the ceremony, while benches arranged throughout the hall ensured that all guests would have clear views of the proceedings. The assembled company represented a gathering of the regional nobility, with barons, knights, and their ladies dressed in their finest garments for the occasion. The men wore their best robes and mantles, many adorned with fur trim that proclaimed their wealth and status. The women displayed elaborate headdresses and gowns that showcased both their own beauty and their family's prosperity. The collective effect created a visual display that reinforced the significance of the ceremony and the elevated status of those who participated in it. Duke Gilbert of Quelquepart had arrived early to inspect the arrangements and ensure that everything met the standards appropriate to his rank and the solemnity of the occasion. His own costume reflected his superior status, a robe of cloth of gold that caught the light with every movement, a belt set with precious stones, and a chaplet of gold that marked his ducal rank. His presence elevated the entire ceremony and provided the candidates with the highest possible validation of their worthiness. The 6 candidates entered the hall in a formal procession, their movements carefully choreographed to maintain proper dignity and precedence. Amory, as the eldest and heir to significant holdings, led the group, followed by his companions, arranged according to their family's status and the extent of their future inheritances. Each young man carried himself with the bearing appropriate to his station, while maintaining the humility suitable to one about to receive a great honor. The sound of their footsteps on the rush-covered floor seemed unnaturally loud in the expectant silence of the hall. Every eye followed their progress as they moved toward the high table, where the Duke waited to perform the central act of the ceremony. The weight of all those watching eyes reminded each candidate that this moment would be remembered and discussed for years to come, making their behavior a permanent part of their reputations. The ritual questions, testing worthiness. Before proceeding to the actual dubbing, Duke Gilbert addressed each candidate individually, asking questions designed to test their understanding of knightly obligations and their commitment to upholding chivalric ideals. This examination served both practical and ceremonial purposes. It verified that the young men understood what they were undertaking, while providing the assembled guests with evidence of their worthiness to receive the honor of knighthood. The questions followed traditional formulas that had been refined over generations of similar ceremonies. Each candidate was asked to confirm his noble birth, his training in arms, and his commitment to defending the church and protecting the innocent. These responses, delivered in clear voices that carried throughout the hall, served as public vows that would bind the new knights throughout their careers. Do you swear by your faith that you are born of father and mother of noble lineage, and that no villain's blood flows in your veins? The Duke inquired of each candidate in turn. This question addressed fundamental concerns about social hierarchy and the preservation of aristocratic privilege. A knight's effectiveness depended not only on his personal qualities, but on the respect accorded to his status by others, and this respect was closely tied to perceptions of legitimate noble birth. Do you swear to defend Holy Church and her ministers against all who would do them harm? Came the second question, acknowledging the knight's role as a protector of Christian institutions. This obligation reflected the gradual Christianization of knightly ideals and the Church's success in channeling martial energy toward spiritual purposes. The knight's positive response committed them to using their military skills in defense of religious authority. Do you swear to protect the widow, the orphan, and the poor, and to succor all who are in distress? The third question addressed the knight's responsibility toward society's most vulnerable members. This obligation transformed the knight from a mere warrior into a defender of justice and protector of those who could not protect themselves. It represented, perhaps, the most idealistic aspect of the chivalric code, and the one that most clearly distinguished the knight from a simple man-at-arms. Each candidate's responses rang clearly through the hall, their voices steady, despite the magnitude of the commitments they were making. These vows would govern their behavior for the remainder of their lives, providing both moral guidance and legal obligations that could be enforced by their peers and superiors. The moment of dubbing, physical and spiritual transformation. With the ritual questions completed satisfactorily, the moment arrived for the central act of the ceremony, the actual dubbing that would transform squires into knights. Each candidate approached Duke Gilbert individually, kneeling before him to receive the blow that would mark their elevation to full warrior status. This physical act, simple in itself, carried profound symbolic meaning that resonated throughout medieval society. The Duke drew his sword with ceremonial deliberation, the polished blade catching the light as it emerged from its decorated scabbard. The weapon he wielded had itself received the blessing of knighthood many years earlier, and its use in this ceremony connected the new knights to an unbroken chain of martial tradition stretching back through generations of warriors. Amory approached first, his heart beating rapidly as he knelt before the Duke and bowed his head to receive the accolade. The assembled guests watched in complete silence as Duke Gilbert raised his sword and brought the flat of the blade down firmly upon Amory's shoulder. "Be thou a good knight," the Duke proclaimed, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. The physical sensation of the blow was surprisingly sharp, despite the Duke's careful control. The impact seemed to resonate through Amory's entire body, marking not merely his shoulder, but his entire being with the transformation he was undergoing. In that instant, his legal status changed permanently. He was no longer a squire dependent upon others, but a knight, with the right to hold land, command men, and participate fully in the feudal hierarchy. The formal words of dubbing followed ancient patterns that connected this ceremony to countless similar occasions throughout the medieval world. "Be thou a good knight" was more than a simple blessing. It was a command that would guide the new knight's behavior throughout his career. The phrase encapsulated the entire chivalric code in 4 simple words, challenging the recipient to live up to the highest ideals of his new status. Each of the other candidates received identical treatment, the ceremony's repetitive nature creating a rhythm that enhanced its spiritual impact. As the 6th and final candidate rose from his knees as a newly dubbed knight, the hall erupted in cheers and congratulations. The transformation was complete. 6 squires had entered the hall, but 6 knights now stood before the assembled company. The girding of swords, symbols of authority. Following the dubbing itself, the ceremony continued with the girding of swords, a ritual that formally granted the new knights the right to bear the primary symbol of their authority. Each knight's sword was blessed individually before being fastened around his waist, marking him as one authorized to dispense justice and defend the realm. This act transformed the weapon from a mere tool into a symbol of legitimate authority. Duke Gilbert personally fastened each sword belt, his hands steady despite his advanced years, as he secured the elaborate buckles and adjusted the hang of each weapon. The swords themselves were magnificent examples of the armorer's art, their hilts gleaming with gold and precious stones, while their blades reflected the skill of master craftsmen. These weapons would serve not merely as instruments of war, but as constant reminders of the knight's obligations and authority. The belt that held each sword was itself a work of art, crafted from the finest leather and decorated with metalwork that proclaimed the wearer's status. Gold thread had been worked into intricate patterns, while precious stones caught the light at regular intervals along the belt's length. These decorative elements served practical purposes, as well as aesthetic ones, as the belt's beauty reinforced the knight's claim to noble status and worthy treatment. As each sword was girded about his waist, the new knight felt the weight of the weapon pulling at his side, a constant physical reminder of his new responsibilities. The The sword would accompany him wherever he went, marking him as a member of the warrior class and ready to defend his honor or that of others. The weapon's presence would influence his behavior in countless subtle ways, reminding him always that he carried the authority and obligation to act when justice demanded intervention. The symbolic significance of the sword extended far beyond its practical utility as a weapon. Medieval culture invested these implements with almost mystical properties, viewing them as extensions of their owners' souls and repositories of their honor. A knight's sword became part of his identity in ways that modern observers might find difficult to understand, representing not merely a tool, but a sacred trust that connected him to his ancestors and his obligations to future generations. The golden spurs, marks of cavalry, status. The ceremony continued with the fastening of golden spurs to each new knight's heels, marking them as members of the cavalry elite who would fight on horseback rather than on foot. These spurs were more than merely functional equipment for controlling horses. They were badges of honor that proclaimed the wearer's elevated status within the military hierarchy. The gold from which they were fashioned made them suitable only for those of noble birth and sufficient wealth. The craftsmanship evident in each pair of spurs reflected the importance of this symbolic element. Master goldsmiths had shaped the precious metal into elegant curves that would provide effective control over a destrier while creating objects of remarkable beauty. The rowels were delicately fashioned wheels with points sharp enough to encourage obedience from even the most spirited warhorse, while decorative elements enhanced their visual appeal. The act of fastening the spurs followed specific rituals that emphasized their significance. Duke Gilbert knelt briefly to secure each pair, a gesture that seemed to reverse the normal hierarchy, but actually emphasized the sacred nature of the knightly calling. By humbling himself momentarily to perform this service, the Duke demonstrated that knighthood represented a form of consecration that deserved respect from all ranks of society. As the golden spurs were secured around their ankles, the new knights felt the weight of these symbols with every step they took. The spurs would serve as constant reminders of their status as mounted warriors, members of an elite class whose effectiveness in battle depended on the partnership between man and horse. The sound of spurs jingling became associated with the approach of authority and the possibility of justice or protection for those in need. The tradition of golden spurs had ancient roots in the customs of the Germanic tribes that had conquered the Roman Empire centuries earlier. These warrior peoples had long associated spurs with equestrian skill and the authority to lead men in battle. The medieval ceremony thus connected the new knights not only to contemporary traditions, but to ancient customs that stretched back to the very foundations of European civilization. The mantles, cloaks of honor and protection. The final element of the dubbing ceremony involved the presentation of mantles to each new knight, splendid cloaks that served both practical and symbolic functions. These garments provided protection from the elements, while proclaiming the wearer's status through their rich materials and elaborate decoration. The mantles given to Amory and his companions had been specially commissioned for the occasion, representing significant investments in materials and craftsmanship. Each mantle was fashioned from the finest available cloth, with colors chosen to complement the knight's heraldic devices and family traditions. The fabric was often imported from distant lands, with silks from Constantinople and fine woolens from Flanders, representing the international trade networks that supplied luxury goods to the medieval nobility. The elaborate weaving and dyeing processes required to create such materials made them extremely valuable and appropriate only for the most significant occasions. The decoration of the mantles involved skilled embroiderers who spent months creating intricate patterns that told stories of valor and virtue. Golden threads were worked into complex designs that caught and reflected light with every movement of the wearer. Precious stones were sometimes sewn into the fabric at strategic points, creating glittering accents that enhanced the garment's magnificence. The overall effect was to create a piece of wearable art that proclaimed the knight's status and achievements. The fastening of each mantle followed ceremonial protocols that emphasized the garment's significance. Duke Gilbert, personally, secured the elaborate brooches that held the cloaks in place, ensuring that each knight was properly attired before the assembled company. These brooches were themselves works of art, fashioned from precious metals and decorated with gemstones that reflected the wearer's wealth and status. As the mantles settled around their shoulders, the new knights felt themselves fully transformed into members of the warrior elite. The weight and warmth of the rich fabric provided physical comfort, while the garment's beauty enhanced their sense of dignity and responsibility. These cloaks would accompany them to tournaments, diplomatic missions, and other occasions where their appearance needed to reflect their elevated status within feudal society. The first acts of knighthood, demonstrations of largesse. With the formal dubbing ceremony complete, tradition called for the new knights to demonstrate their worthiness through acts of largesse, the generous distribution of gifts that proved their noble character and financial capability. This custom served multiple purposes. It provided immediate evidence of the knights' qualifications for their new status, while creating bonds of obligation and gratitude that would prove useful throughout their careers. Amory had prepared for this moment by accumulating a substantial collection of valuable items, specifically for distribution among the assembled guests and castle servants. Gold and silver coins formed the foundation of his largesse, but he had also acquired fine fabrics, decorated weapons, and pieces of jewelry that would serve as appropriate gifts for different ranks of recipients. The total value of these presents represented a significant portion of his inheritance, but the investment was considered essential for establishing his reputation. The distribution of gifts followed specific protocols that reflected the complex hierarchy of medieval society. The most valuable presents were reserved for Duke Gilbert and other high-ranking nobles whose support would be crucial for the new knight's future success. Lesser nobles received gifts appropriate to their status, while servants and common folk shared in the distribution according to their positions within the castle community. The psychological impact of this display of generosity extended far beyond its immediate material effects. Witnesses to the new knight's largesse would remember his behavior and speak of it in other contexts, helping to establish his reputation throughout the broader noble community. The gifts themselves would serve as constant reminders of the knight's character and the obligations created by his generosity. The tradition of knightly largesse reflected fundamental values that distinguished the aristocracy from other social classes. While merchants might accumulate wealth for its own sake, nobles were expected to view their resources as tools for creating and maintaining the relationships that formed the foundation of feudal society. This generous distribution of wealth demonstrated that the new knight understood his obligations and possessed the resources necessary to fulfill them. The feast, celebration, and community. Following the completion of the dubbing ceremony and the distribution of largesse, the entire company moved to participate in an elaborate feast that would continue the celebration well into the night. The great hall had been prepared, with tables arranged to accommodate the complex precedence requirements of medieval society, with seating positions carefully assigned to reflect each guest's status and relationship to the host family. The high table, positioned on a raised platform at one end of the hall, provided seating for Duke Gilbert, the new knights, and the most important nobles in attendance. This elevated position allowed them to oversee the entire gathering while being visible to all the other guests. The table itself was covered with the finest available linens and set with the family's best plate, creating a display that reflected their wealth and sophistication. The menu for the feast had been planned with careful attention to both culinary excellence and symbolic significance. Multiple courses would be served, beginning with lighter dishes designed to stimulate the appetite and proceeding through increasingly elaborate preparations that showcase the kitchen staff's skills. Exotic spices imported from distant lands would flavor many of the dishes, demonstrating the family's wealth and connections to international trade networks. The service of each course followed elaborate rituals that reinforced social hierarchies while providing entertainment for the assembled guests. Trumpets announced the arrival of each new dish, while ceremonial tasters ensured the safety of the food served to high-ranking guests. Carved and decorated presentations transformed ordinary ingredients into works of art that pleased the eye as well as the palate. Throughout the meal, entertainment was provided by professional musicians and storytellers who had been engaged specifically for the occasion. Jongleurs sang songs celebrating knightly valor and courtly love, while acrobats and jugglers provided lighter diversions between courses. The combination of excellent food, fine wine, and skilled entertainment created an atmosphere of joy and celebration that befitted the significance of the day's events. Stories of ancient heroes, inspiration, and example. As the feast progressed and wine loosened tongues throughout the hall, conversation naturally turned to stories of legendary knights whose deeds provided inspiration and example for the newly dubbed warriors. These tales served educational purposes as well as entertainment, transmitting cultural values and behavioral expectations through memorable narratives that would influence the new knights' understanding of their calling. The Song of Roland remained perhaps the most popular of these heroic narratives, recounting the legendary paladin's last stand at Roncevaux and his unwavering loyalty to Emperor Charlemagne. The story's themes of courage, honor, and self-sacrifice resonated powerfully with audiences of medieval knights, providing a template for ideal behavior in the face of overwhelming odds. Roland's refusal to sound his horn for help until too late demonstrated the complex relationship between pride and honor that characterized the chivalric ideal. Tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table offered another rich source of inspiration, though these stories were still evolving during the 13th century and had not yet achieved their later canonical form. The Arthurian narratives provided examples of knights pursuing quests for spiritual as well as material goals, seeking the Holy Grail, or undertaking missions that tested their moral character as much as their martial prowess. More recent historical examples also featured prominently in these after-dinner discussions. The deeds of Godfrey of Bouillon during the First Crusade provided inspiring examples of Christian knighthood in action, while stories of contemporary heroes like William Marshall demonstrated that legendary achievements remained possible for those who combine skill, courage, and wisdom. These stories served multiple functions within the social gathering. They entertained guests during the long meal, while educating younger listeners about the expectations and possibilities associated with knightly status. The narratives also provided common cultural references that helped bind the aristocratic community together, creating shared values and aspirations that transcended regional and political boundaries. The responsibilities of leadership, managing estates, and vassals. As the evening progressed, the conversation among the more serious-minded guests turned to practical matters of estate management and the responsibilities that would accompany the new knight's elevated status. These discussions provided valuable education for the young men who would soon need to manage their own properties and maintain the complex relationships that bound feudal society together. The management of agricultural estates required considerable knowledge and skill, as these properties formed the economic foundation that supported knightly lifestyles. Understanding crop rotation, animal husbandry, and seasonal labor patterns was essential for maintaining productivity and profitability. The new knights would need to work closely with their bailiffs and reeves to ensure that their lands generated sufficient income to support their households and military obligations. The relationship between lords and vassals represented another crucial aspect of medieval political life that the new knights would need to master. Managing these relationships required a delicate balance between authority and cooperation, as lords needed to command respect while maintaining the loyalty and support of their subordinates. The feudal contract created mutual obligations that could not be ignored without risking the breakdown of the entire system. Military leadership would represent perhaps the most challenging aspect of the new knights' responsibilities. They would be expected to lead men in battle, making life and death decisions under extreme stress, while maintaining the morale and effectiveness of their forces. This leadership required not only personal courage, but also tactical knowledge, strategic thinking, and the ability to inspire others to follow them into dangerous situations. The legal responsibilities associated with lordship added another layer of complexity to the knight's future duties. They would serve as judges in local disputes, arbitrating conflicts between their vassals and ensuring that justice was maintained within their territories. This judicial role required knowledge of both customary law and feudal precedent, as well as the wisdom to balance competing claims and interests. The continuing education of knights, learning beyond martial arts. Despite the completion of their formal dubbing ceremony, the new knight's education was far from finished. The complexities of medieval society required ongoing learning and adaptation, as successful knights needed to master diplomatic skills, financial management, and the subtle arts of courtly behavior that would serve them throughout their careers. The intellectual requirements of knighthood extended far beyond the martial skills that had dominated their youth. Reading and writing, while not universal among the warrior class, were increasingly valuable for managing correspondence with distant allies and understanding the legal documents that governed feudal relationships. Knowledge of Latin remained essential for participating in formal ceremonies and understanding the religious dimensions of their calling. Musical and poetic skills were becoming increasingly important for knights who wished to participate fully in courtly society. The ability to compose or perform songs could enhance a knight's reputation and provide opportunities for advancing his career through cultural as well as military achievements. These artistic pursuits also offered acceptable outlets for expressing emotions and ideas that might otherwise find less constructive expression. Diplomatic skills would prove crucial for knights who aspired to positions of significant responsibility within the feudal hierarchy. The ability to negotiate effectively, understand the motivations of potential allies and enemies, and navigate the complex web of feudal obligations could determine the success or failure of entire military campaigns and political initiatives. The quiet hours, reflection on a life transformed. As the great feast gradually wound down and the castle began to settle into the quiet rhythms of night, Amory found himself walking alone through the torchlit corridors, reflecting on the magnitude of the transformation he had undergone. The weight of his new sword at his side and the golden spurs on his heels served as constant reminders that he was no longer the same person who had knelt for vigil in the chapel just hours before. The responsibilities that now rested upon his shoulders seemed almost overwhelming in the silence of the sleeping castle. He thought of the vassals who would look to him for leadership, the peasants whose welfare would depend upon his wisdom and justice, and the broader obligations he had undertaken to defend the church and protect the innocent. These duties would shape every decision he made for the remainder of his life. Yet along with the weight of responsibility came a profound sense of pride and accomplishment. He had achieved the goal toward which his entire youth had been directed, joining the ranks of those whose courage and skill protected Christian civilization from its enemies. The training, sacrifice, and dedication of years had culminated in this moment of recognition and elevation to full warrior status. The bonds forged with his 5 companions during their shared vigil and ceremony would prove among the most important relationships of their lives. These men understood the pressures and obligations of knighthood in ways that others never could, and their mutual support would prove invaluable during the challenges that lay ahead. The brotherhood of arms created connections that transcended family ties and political allegiances. As sleep finally began to claim him in the early hours of dawn, Amory's thoughts turned to the future adventures that awaited. Perhaps he would join a crusading expedition to the Holy Land, following in the footsteps of heroes like Godfrey of Bouillon. Perhaps he would distinguish himself in tournaments, earning fame and fortune through displays of martial prowess. Or perhaps he would find his calling in the patient work of managing his estates and caring for his dependents, proving that true nobility could be expressed through faithful service as well as glorious deeds. The torch flames flickered lower as the castle settled into the deep quiet of night, and our long journey through the intricate world of medieval knighthood draws gently to its close. The weapons and armor that had claimed so much of our attention rest now in their appointed places, waiting for the dawn that will bring new challenges and opportunities. The great war horses stand quietly in their stables, their day's work complete, while the newly dubbed knights sleep the deep sleep of those who have achieved their heart's desire. In the silence of these peaceful hours, we leave young Amory and his companions to their well-earned rest, knowing that the morrow will bring fresh adventures and new tests of the courage, honor, and wisdom they have pledged to uphold. The ceremony of knighthood has ended, but the true journey of chivalric service has only just begun. Let these gentle images of medieval life carry you now toward your own peaceful slumber as we bid farewell to this distant world of honor, duty, and noble aspiration that once shaped the destiny of Europe and continues to inspire our dreams of courage and righteousness even today.